Money FM 89.3. Best of breakfast. Morning Shot.
Good morning and welcome to Morning Shot with Ahmad Akhtar. As geopolitical tensions heat up across the globe, it's not just borders and battlegrounds feeling the strain. The world's biggest international institutions are under pressure as well. Today we're talking about whether bodies like the United Nations still work as intended as platforms for dialogue and diplomacy, or if they're showing signs of strain in a more divided world. So is multilateralism still the answer in these uncertain times? What lessons can we draw from the latest flashpoints? And what might all this mean for the future of international diplomacy? Joining us to share his insights is Dr. Oe Sun, Senior Fellow at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Good morning, Dr. O, from an Osaka train station.
Yes, very good morning indeed. I just arrived here.
Well, I hope you have a pleasant stay. Let's crack on with this to begin with. How well are international bodies like the UN holding up in today's environment of rising geopolitical tensions?
Well, I happen to have worked in the UN system before in the two agencies, the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, as well as a specialized agency, the International Telecommunication Union, both headquartered in Geneva in Switzerland. Now, I remember during the early days of my career there, one of my seniors told me two very important things about the UN. Number one is the UN is the last line of hope for many people around the world and for resolving many crises around the world. So usually some other parties will try to resolve those crises, but if they were not successful, then they turn to the UN. And number two, the UN system, it could only be as effective as the verse of its member states. If UN's member states are not really helping or are not really putting in efforts, well, then UN is also in a sense parallelized. I think that is the sentiments echoed by none other than one of the former Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, in one of his most recent essays, that if we are not careful, then really we would have a declining UN because, many other countries, many superpowers, for example, would take things into their own hands and try to resolve what they perceive as a crisis. Yeah,
it's interesting you mentioned that the UN is looked upon as the last line of hope. I want to cite an essay that was written in The Guardian by a former UN Under-Secretary General, Jamal Ben Omar. And he cited Israel's devastating war in Gaza, which has spilled into Lebanon and now ensued in Iran as well. We've got millions facing the possibility of starvation in conflict-torn Sudan, and the deadly war in Ukraine marches on. And he wrote that the UN was created nearly 80 years ago to maintain international peace and security, but is failing to prevent or mediate any of these conflicts. What are your thoughts on his take?
Well, I think in the initial years, UN was rather, shall we say, powerful with very proactive secretary generals such as Tak Hammarskjöld of Norway, such as U Thant from Burma at that time, now Myanmar. They were very proactive and they were able to get heavily involved in, for example, the Korean War and then the Congo crisis and so on. But I think with the advent of the Vietnam War, UN's role has been greatly diminished. In the 1990s, when I was working in the UN, my then big boss, Kofi Annan, he also tried to be a proactive Secretary General involving UN in the former Yugoslavia and so on. But of course, then bigger powers such as NATO, such as the United States, they took over those roles, not exactly peacekeeping role, but shall we say a peace-enhancing role by, for example, bombing what they perceive to be unfriendly parties and so on. And that continues to today. In Gaza, for example, there's supposed to be a UN agency there called the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine and the Near East. But of course, it is rendered almost completely ineffective by the ongoing wars there. The latest thing would be in Iran, right? The nuclear sites in Iran. The International Atomic Energy Agency, they actually had inspectors who were supposed to inspect those sites. But on the one hand, Iran, doesn't quite welcome them. On the other hand, the US side, I don't think they also quite trust the IAEA. So, if, again, as I said, if the member states do not work hand in hand with UN, the UN could easily be paralyzed. Yeah.
Yeah, so what are the reasons for this diminished role? Is it a lack of resources? Is it a chain of command problem? Perhaps a hierarchical structure getting in the way of some kind of reform for the UN? Mr. Benemar also cites last year the conclusion of the UN Summit of the Future. The outcome document of the summit, he says, was the Pact for the Future, which was agreed after lengthy and often acrimonious negotiations. Yet most of the text, he says, is made up of rehashed and recycled wording from previously agreed UN documents.
Well, I cannot agree more with his sentiments. I think there are at least two reasons why the UN nowadays is not taken very seriously. Number one, it's its decision-making process, and especially in the Security Council, right? As you know, those 5 permanent members, they have this so-called veto power, right? So, there are many issues around the world. Sometimes you and I would think, well, perhaps UN should act or UN should condemn, but because of one permanent member, sometimes US, sometimes Russia, sometimes China vetoing that kind of action, well, then you cannot have a UN resolution to that effect. Number two, it's also, having worked in the UN system, the UN bureaucracy is indeed very tremendous. Sometimes there are overlapping jurisdiction, overlapping subject matters, and, some countries, especially the US, will perceive this as being very wasteful, and then they reduce the amount of contribution. Well, when you don't have money, then you can't move, right?
Yeah, good that you mentioned the U.S., because my next question revolves around some developments over the recent weekend. We saw that the G7 nations agreed to exempt U.S. multinational companies from a global minimum tax imposed by other countries, a compromise which President Donald Trump's government had actually pushed hard for. What does that say, Dr. O, about how power imbalances impact the credibility and the fairness of international institutions?
Well, again, international organizations, they consist not, frankly speaking, of you and me and our friends. They consist of sovereign nations, or rather their governments, right? So when you have, just like any organization, when you have more powerful members, typically they will dominate over the agenda of the organization. And G7, of course, is, shall we say, a very US dominant or US dominated organization. Just as the UN, it's, I would say, totally dominated by the 5 permanent members. So other member states, of course, they say, so why should I sort of continue to play an active role? My voice could not effectively be channeled, right? So it's a chicken and egg thing. If the bigger powers, they are too overbearing, the smaller ones would not like to work with them. On the other hand, if the smaller ones would like to gain more powers, then the bigger powers will say, hey, I will just throw in my towers. Yeah.
Well, on that point, for smaller nations like Singapore that do rely on international law, do the principles of the UN Charter still carry practical weight today?
Well, I can see Singapore and a number of other, shall we say, middle powers, they are trying very hard to make their voices heard. And Singapore does that quite effectively because Singapore has the expertise. My good friend, Professor Tommy Kaur, for example, he chaired some of the most outstanding UN conferences and is widely respected. And therefore, by extension too, people will respect Singapore a lot. Many other examples as well. But not many other countries can do that, right? I mean, Singapore has this sort of tremendous expertise, but some other countries of comparable GDP and size from the more developing world, they simply could not afford to do that. So that's why there's a degree of frustration on their part. Yeah.
Yeah, and many of those countries are here in ASEAN. So from a regional perspective, what can ASEAN or other multilateral bodies learn from the UN's current challenges?
Well, ASEAN turned out to be a rather good role model, ironically, because on the one hand, ASEAN also works on unanimity, namely consensus, namely any ASEAN country could veto ASEAN's resolution. But on the other hand, ASEAN does not impose itself on its member states. They have a lot of freedom to do what they consider to be sovereign matters. But in terms of economic matters, they come together to try to reach free trade agreements and so on. So actually, a lot of other parts of the world, it's looking up ASEAN as a sort of, I wouldn't say a role model, but at least one model for their parts of the world to come together. Yeah.
Okay, so you did touch on this earlier, that there would be risks if trust in international institutions continue to erode. What are some of the biggest ones that you foresee?
Well, of course, you can have armed conflicts, right? It used to be in the 1950s and 60s, if two or more parties are having some sort of combat, some sort of war, when the UN intervened, I wouldn't say they would immediately put down their arms, but they listened. And they would enter into negotiations, UN-mediated negotiations. This is not quite the case nowadays. You see, the recently concluded Congolese civil war, that was brokered by the United States and not through UN. And even the US is like Johnny come lately. It's only during this administration, they took a sudden interest in that long-going conflict, right? I mean, imagine if UN were as powerful as in its early days, then UN could at least put together the two parties to sit down together to discuss some peace terms. But no, UN was not able to do so over the last, shall we say, 30 years, even though UN provided a lot of humanitarian assistance. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's fairly self-evident that meaningful reform of the UN is more pressing than ever. What would that actually look like, and how realistic is it in today's political climate?
Well, I think number one, that sort of veto power, you could modify a little bit. Instead of any country, any permanent member could veto, you could put it like you need at least two permanent members, right, to veto a resolution. You can include more the bigger countries from the developing world into the permanent Security Council seats. As to the bureaucracy of UN, well, now that Elon Musk is out of a job in the US government, right, perhaps the UN could engage him on a pro bono basis to sort of shake things up a little bit for, let's say, half a year. And that, I think, will satisfy a lot of, especially the bigger powers who had to put up a lot of money to the UN system. Yeah.
So are there parts of the UN system, Dr. O, that still function effectively behind the scenes, even if they don't get public attention?
Yes, like one of the agencies I work for, the International Telecommunication Union. As we are speaking now, we need frequency. We need frequency in order to transmit our signals and so on. And that is regulated by the ITU, for example. The World Trade Organization nowadays is not quite as effective as before. But you have many others, the World Intellectual Property Organization, the Director General of which is a Singaporean, by the way. So all these agencies are working, as you said, behind the scene to make sure that internationally we do have a semblance of functionality. Yeah.
All right, Dr. O, well, it was a pleasure having you on the show. The UN was created nearly 80 years ago to maintain international peace and security. Questions are still being asked about the UN's relevance in today's world, given the political tensions and wars we are seeing unfolding in front of our very eyes. Thank you for deconstructing all that you could this morning.
Thank you very much indeed.
You're very welcome. Have a good day. That was Dr. O.A. Sun, Senior Fellow at the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, and you're listening to Money FM 89.3.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.